The terms are non-negotiable. You will comply.
Help days.
My name is Chloe Hayes, and for most of my life, my family had a stock market. Except instead of Apple and Tesla, the two main tickers were Megan and Chloe. Megan, my older sister, was the blue chip stock, the safe bet. She was on the fast track to becoming a doctor, and in my family's eyes, that was like investing in Google back in 2004. A guaranteed, brag-worthy return. And then there was me. I was the crypto of the family. The weird, unpredictable startup that wanted to build an app for something. My parents looked at my dreams the way you'd look at a company trying to sell artisanal toothpicks. Interesting, maybe, but you're not betting your retirement on it. This wasn't just a feeling. It was a business decision. A decision made one evening in our suburban Texas home that would lead to 4 years of ramen noodles, questionable roommates, and a whole lot of hustle. It all came to a head on graduation day, a day that wasn't just about a diploma, but about a final, public audit of my family's worst investment. Before I tell you what made my parents' faces go from proud to pale faster than a stock market crash, let me give you a quick rundown of what's coming up. We're going to start with the family scoreboard and see how my parents' obsession with a safe ROI set the stage for everything. Then, I'll take you through the 4 years of my ramen noodle and roommate hustle, the real, unglamorous, and frankly hilarious story of building a business from absolutely nothing. We'll see the first cracks appear, not in my plan, but in my family's perfect golden child narrative. And finally, we'll get to the main event, graduation day. The moment when a series of public announcements turned a celebration into a shareholder meeting from hell, revealing a shocking secret my parents had been hiding for years. This isn't just a revenge story. It's a story about how being underestimated can be your greatest asset and how the best return you'll ever get is from betting on yourself. So, stick around. The story of how the family's bad stock ended up with a multi-million-dollar buyout is one you won't want to miss. You know, everyone has a story like this in some way. A moment they were underestimated, a battle no one saw. We believe those stories deserve to be heard. If you have a story you've been waiting to tell, we've opened up a space for you. Click the anonymous link pinned in the comments and share it with us. Your story could be the one we feature next, giving a voice to your journey. And it goes even further. For every 1,000 views this video gets, we're donating $1 to a fund that supports young people who are fighting to build their own futures against the odds. By watching, you're not just hearing a story, you're helping to write a new one for someone else. All right, let's get into it. It all started with a glass cabinet in our living room. So, that glass cabinet in our living room. Let me paint you a picture. In most homes in Austin, a cabinet like that is for your grandmother's fine china or maybe some quirky souvenirs from a road trip. In the Hayes household, it was something else entirely. It was a shrine. A brightly lit, meticulously dusted shrine dedicated to Saint Megan of Pre-Med. Inside, you'd find the gold-plated science Olympiad medals, the debate team trophies that were taller than our dog, and her perfect attendance certificates stacked up like gold bars at Fort Knox. It was a visual resume of a flawless academic specimen. Every inch of that cabinet screamed, this one's a winner, a future doctor, and my contribution to this glorious display. Well, for a while, there was a ribbon I won for 3rd place in a 4th grade art contest. It was a drawing of a squirrel. A very, very misshapen squirrel. Last I saw it, it was propping open the door to the hall closet because the latch was broken. A perfect metaphor, really. You see, my parents didn't see us as just their daughters. They saw us as their portfolio. Megan was their blue chip stock. She was Amazon, Google, Apple, all rolled into one. Dependable, prestigious, with a clear, upward trajectory. Her path to becoming Dr. Megan Hayes was a safe, long-term investment that would pay dividends in the form of social status and bragging rights at neighborhood barbecues for years to come. I, on the other hand, was their speculative asset. I was the family's designated artistic one, the one who was always taking apart old computers or trying to build websites. To them, my ambitions were like investing in a cryptocurrency nobody had ever heard of or a startup that sold custom-fit sweaters for lizards. It sounded creative, but it was volatile, risky. It didn't have a neat, predictable path you could chart on a graph. It took me a while to understand their logic, but it really came down to their own wiring. My dad, Frank, is an engineer. He trusts blueprints, formulas, and proven systems. To him, a career path that didn't come with a 200-page textbook was basically witchcraft. My mom, Brenda, sells real estate. Her world revolves around curb appeal, first impressions, and perceived value. She knew exactly how to market a 3-bedroom house with a great school district, and she approached her children the same way. Having a doctor in the family is the ultimate open house selling point. It just screams success. And for a long time, I just accepted it. It was just the way things were. Megan was the safe bet, I was the wild card. The lesson I learned early on wasn't a bitter one, just a clinical one. I wasn't being compared as a daughter. I was being evaluated as an asset. My value wasn't inherent. It was based on my potential for a predictable return. This whole dynamic was just a low hum in the background of our lives until the spring of my senior year. That was the day the mail came. 2 thick envelopes from Redwood University, one for each of us. We'd both gotten in. I remember my mom crying with joy, my dad actually putting his phone down to clap me on the back. For a brief, shining moment, it felt like both stocks in the Hayes family portfolio were soaring. That night, my dad called a family meeting to discuss college plans. I walked into that living room buzzing with excitement, completely clueless that I was walking into my own performance review. And the forecast wasn't looking good. So there we were, in the living room. My mom had brought out the good coasters, the ones that aren't just old magazines. Megan was practically vibrating with excitement next to me on the couch. I was picturing decorating my dorm room, maybe finally getting a mini fridge that wasn't from the Stone Age. My dad, Frank, sat in his armchair, the one he calls his command center. He cleared his throat, holding a manila folder like he was about to present quarterly earnings to a board of directors. Which, in a way, he was. He started with the good news. Girls, your mother and I are incredibly proud. Redwood University is a top-tier institution. Getting 1 daughter accepted is an achievement. Getting 2, well, that's just fantastic. I felt a genuine smile spread across my face. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe the portfolio was finally balanced. Then he opened the folder. We've been running the numbers, he said, his engineer brain kicking into high gear. He slid a spreadsheet across the coffee table. It was a budget, detailed down to the penny. Tuition, room and board, books, the total cost for one student was a lot. Like, buy a nice car every year a lot. As you can see, he continued, sending both of you is a significant financial undertaking. We've saved diligently, but we have to be strategic with our resources. A weird feeling started to creep into the back of my neck. The kind of feeling you get right before the stock market takes a nosedive. He looked at Megan first, his expression softening. Megan, your path is clear. Pre-med is a demanding but secure track. The outcome is predictable. We are fully prepared to cover your entire 4 years, so you can focus entirely on your studies without any financial distractions. Megan beamed, a wave of relief washing over her face. I waited for my turn, my smile feeling a little stiff now. I figured he'd say something like, "And Chloe, we've got you covered too." He didn't. The silence in the room became heavy. My mom was suddenly very interested in a loose thread on a couch cushion. Finally, I had to ask, "And what about for me?" My dad took a deep breath. He didn't look at me. He looked at the spreadsheet as if the numbers would speak for him. "Look, Chloe," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It's not about fairness. It's about ROI, return on investment. We see a clearer, more secure return with Megan's path. A business degree, especially with your creative inclinations, it's a gamble. We can't justify that level of risk for both of you. It's a business decision. A business decision. In that moment, everything clicked into place. All the years of the trophy cabinet, the dismissive comments about my hobbies, the blue chip sister, and the cryptocurrency me. It wasn't personal. It was just business. I wasn't their daughter who had just gotten into her dream school. I was a speculative stock they were choosing not to buy. A line item on a spreadsheet that had just been cut. I don't remember what I said. I think I just nodded, got up, and walked to my room. The sound of my parents and Megan starting to excitedly plan her dorm shopping followed me down the hall. I locked my door and slid down against it, the tears finally coming. But they weren't just tears of hurt. They were tears of a cold, hard clarity. This was the BAI H letter 1 ECDC key D stroke letter 1 EAFNG NH letter 1 EA5T. In the eyes of my own family, I was a bad investment. After about an hour of ugly crying, I did the only thing I could think of. I called my Aunt Carol. She's my dad's younger sister, a retired CPA who drinks her whiskey neat and has the kind of no-nonsense attitude that could make a drill sergeant flinch. I poured out the whole story between sobs, the spreadsheet, the business decision, the ROI. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, I heard her let out a string of curses that would make a sailor blush. Investment. She finally barked into the phone, her voice dripping with righteous fury. Investment? Let me tell you something, kid. The only bad investment is betting against a Hayes woman with her back against the wall. Your father, the engineer, he can only see the bridge that's already been built. He can't see the one you're about to design. Her voice suddenly shifted from anger to strategy. All right, stop crying. Crying doesn't fund a startup. Now listen up. Here's what you're gonna do. And just like that, I had my first angel investor. Not with money, but with something far more valuable, a battle plan. Armed with Aunt Carol's battle plan, which was basically a very aggressive Excel spreadsheet outlining every possible scholarship and student loan, I landed in Austin. While my parents were co-signing a lease for Megan's cushy, fully furnished dorm room near campus, I was deep in the trenches of Craigslist, looking for a place to live. I found one. It was a 4-bedroom apartment, charmingly described as vintage and full of character, which are real estate code words for old, and the plumbing makes noises like a dying whale. The ad promised a lovely courtyard view, which turned out to be a view of the brick wall of the building next door, about 3 feet away. But the rent was cheap, and cheap was my love language. My roommates were a sociological experiment. There was Leo, the drummer for a death metal band called Corpse Grinder. He was surprisingly gentle and communicated mostly through grunts and offering me leftover pizza. Then there was Juniper, who made artisanal, small-batch candles with scents like disappointed ghost and librarian sweater. And finally, there was Ben, a philosophy major who, every time it was his turn to do the dishes, would stare into the sink and ask, "But if a dish is dirty and no one is there to perceive it, is it truly unclean?" Deep thoughts that somehow never resulted in a clean fork. My life became a chaotic portfolio of side hustles. The battle plan covered tuition, but I had to eat. So, I got a job at a campus coffee shop, mastering the art of the 5 a.m. opening shift and smiling while people who hadn't had caffeine yet yelled their impossibly complex latte orders at me. But that wasn't enough. On nights and weekends, I became a gig economy warrior. I designed logos on Fiverr for $17 a pop. I tutored spoiled freshmen in basic coding, patiently explaining what a for loop was for the 10th time. I even had a brief, glorious stint as a dog walker for an Instagram life coach whose chihuahua had more followers than I did. My resume looked less like a career path and more like a cry for help. Meanwhile, on social media, the Hayes family PR machine was in full swing. My mom would post these glowing updates about Megan, complete with photos of her in a pristine lab coat, looking serious and doctorly. The captions were always something like, "So proud of our future Dr. Hayes. Following her dreams and making us proud. Pre-med life blessed." I'd see those posts on my phone while on my 15-minute break, covered in coffee grounds. I couldn't compete with that, so I started my own counter-narrative. I'd post a picture of my dinner, a sad-looking bowl of instant ramen with a single, lonely egg dropped in the middle, and caption it, "Enjoying a deconstructed egg drop soup at Austin's most exclusive new pop-up. Michelin star ramen foodie." It was my own small, pathetic form of rebellion. The first semester was a blur of exhaustion, caffeine, and existential dishwashing debates with Ben. But a crucial lesson started to form in the chaos. When you have no safety net, you learn how to weave your own. Every logo I designed, every latte I frothed, every dollar I budgeted was a thread in the net I was building for myself. It wasn't pretty, and it was full of holes, but it was mine. And while I was busy weaving, I was also learning. Not just in my business classes, but in the real world. I was learning about profit margins from my coffee shop manager, about branding from Juniper's ghost-scented candles, and about inefficiency from the university's terrible scheduling software. My mind was constantly churning, connecting the dots between my textbooks and my reality. I was starting to see problems everywhere. And where there are problems, I was beginning to realize there are business opportunities. One particular problem, a very simple one involving free pizza, would soon give me my first real taste of victory. The problem involving free pizza was this. Redwood University had dozens of student clubs, and every single one of them used the same tactic to lure new members to their meetings: free food. There were free slices from Austin's Pizza on Monday, free tacos on Tuesday, free donuts on Wednesday. It was a beautiful, scattered buffet across campus, but nobody knew where to find it all. So, for a weekend-long university hackathon, I pitched a simple idea to a few classmates. An app that aggregated all campus events with free food into one simple, real-time map. We called it Freeza. You know, like pizza, but free. It was a terrible name, but we were fueled by caffeine and desperation. We spent 48 straight hours coding, designing, and surviving on the very free pizza we were trying to map. By the end, we had a clunky but functional prototype. And somehow, we won. We actually won first place. The prize was $2,000 and a ridiculously oversized check that was impossible to carry back to my apartment. I was ecstatic. It wasn't just the money, though that was a lifesaver. It was the first time something I built, something from my risky little brain, had been validated. One of the judges was a professor from the business school, Dr. Evans, a guy who had sold 2 tech startups before coming back to teach. He pulled me aside afterwards and said, "That's a clever solution to a real user problem. Have you thought about what this could be beyond a class project?" I hadn't, but now a seed was planted. That night, clutching my giant cardboard check, I called my parents. I was buzzing, ready to finally put a real achievement on the family scoreboard. "Hey Mom, Dad, guess what?" I said, launching into the story of the hackathon, the app, the prize money. There was a pause. Then my mom's voice came through the phone, polite but distant. "Oh, that's nice, honey. Very creative." Nice. The same word you used to describe a stranger's hat. Before I could even mention Dr. Evans, she pivoted. "Speaking of achievements, you will not believe the news about Megan. She just got her grade back in organic chemistry. An A+, her professor said it's one of the highest scores he's ever seen. We're taking her out for a steak dinner to celebrate. Organic chemistry. The legendary monster course that pre-med students whispered about in hushed, terrified tones. An A+, of course. The blue chip stock was soaring again, making my little $2,000 win look like pocket change. I mumbled my congratulations, the excitement draining out of me. "Yeah, that's amazing. Tell her I said congrats." "We will, honey." "Gotta go now, we're heading to the restaurant," my mom said cheerfully. But just before she hung up, I heard something in the background. It was faint, but unmistakable. It was the sound of someone crying. A choked, hiccuping sob. Then, a click. She had ended the call. I stood there in my apartment, the smell of Juniper's sad seance candle wafting from her room, and a weird chill went down my spine. I knew that cry. It was Megan's. Why would she be crying on the night she aced the hardest class of her life? It didn't make sense. The official story, the one my parents were broadcasting, was a triumphant steak dinner. But the background noise told a different story. And for the first time, a tiny crack appeared in the perfect, polished facade of St. Megan of Pre-Med. A question lodged itself in my mind, a little piece of code that didn't compute. Was getting an A+ in OChem really supposed to sound that miserable? I didn't have an answer. But I had a feeling the perfect family portfolio my parents were so proud of had some hidden liabilities they weren't disclosing. And I was determined to figure out what they were. After that strange phone call, I made a conscious decision. I couldn't change my family's investment strategy, but I could diversify my own portfolio of people. I started building what I now call my chosen family, a quirky, unlikely group of backers who actually believed in my weird little startup. My first board member was Dr. Evans. I took him up on his offer and met him during his office hours. I walked in expecting a dry, academic lecture. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, put his feet up on his desk, and said, "All right, Hayes. Your app is a great idea, but ideas are cheap. Execution is everything. Now, tell me about the dumbest mistake you think you can make." He didn't just teach me from a textbook. He taught me from his scars. He told me about the time he spent $50,000 on a marketing campaign before he even knew who his customer was. He told me about a co-founder who stole his code. He shared his failures with a kind of cheerful, brutal honesty that was more valuable than any A+. He became my mentor, helping me turn Freeza from a hackathon project into a real, registered LLC. Back at the apartment, my unofficial headquarters, my roommates became my first-round investors, not with cash, but with their own unique talents. Leo, the death metal drummer, started announcing from the stage between songs, "All right, Corpse Grinder fans. Before our next song, Hymn of the Decapitated. If you're a broke college student, download Freeza." It was the most aggressive and surprisingly effective marketing campaign I could have asked for. Juniper, the candle maker, became my impromptu branding consultant. She'd look at my logo designs and say things like, "This shade of blue doesn't evoke the ephemeral joy of a found taco. It's more corporate dread. Let's try something warmer." She was right every time. And Ben, the philosophy major, he was my chief ethics officer. While I was focused on user growth, he'd ask the important questions. By mapping free food, are we discouraging students from learning the valuable life lesson of budgeting for their own sustenance? Are we merely a fleeting distraction from the crushing void of academic pressure? It was exhausting, but it made me think about the why behind what I was doing. This was my team: a cynical professor, a metalhead, a hipster, and a philosopher. It was the weirdest, most dysfunctional, and most supportive board of directors a girl could ask for. The contrast with my actual family was getting starker by the week. My mom would call every Sunday, like clockwork, but the calls weren't conversations. They were briefings. "Hi, honey. Just calling with the weekly Megan report," she'd start, as if she were a news anchor. This week, she was elected treasurer of the Future Doctors of America Club. She also volunteered at the hospital and got a personal commendation from the head of nursing. Stock is trending up. I realized they weren't talking to me, they were talking at me. They weren't having a conversation, they were reading me a press release about their star asset. They never asked about my classes, or my business, or how I was managing to pay my rent. It was as if my entire existence was just a courtesy call they had to make before getting back to the main event. And that was the quiet lesson I learned during that time. Family isn't always about the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's about the people who share your vision. The ones who see your potential not as a risk, but as an opportunity. The ones who will scream about your app between death metal songs. My chosen family was all in, but my original one seemed to be drifting further and further away. And that distance made the strange cry I'd heard over the phone even more unsettling. The more they pushed the perfect Megan story, the more I felt like something was deeply wrong. I just couldn't put my finger on it yet. My gut told me a correction was coming to the Hayes family stock market, and it was going to be a big one. That feeling that something was wrong with Megan kept nagging at me. It was like having a bug in my code that I just couldn't pinpoint. The opportunity to debug the situation came during Thanksgiving break of my sophomore year. I came home for the first time in months, armed with stories about my growing business and a bag full of dirty laundry for my mom to wash. Some things never change, but the person I met wasn't the glowing, confident Megan from my mother's weekly reports. The woman sitting at the dinner table looked drained. She had dark circles under her eyes that even my mom's expensive concealer couldn't hide. She was quiet, picking at her food, and jumped every time her phone buzzed with a notification. She looked less like a star student and more like someone who had just seen a ghost. Specifically, the ghost of her GPA. My chosen family had taught me that you don't let your people struggle alone. So, later that evening, while we were cleaning up in the kitchen, I decided to extend an olive branch. An IPO of goodwill, if you will. "Hey," I said gently, trying to sound as non-threatening as possible. "You look really tired." "I know how brutal sophomore year can be." She just shrugged, scrubbing a plate with unnecessary force. "I was just thinking," I continued, "with all my side hustles and classes, I've gotten weirdly good at time management and study hacks. I have this whole system with digital flashcards and stuff. If you ever need a hand organizing your notes or just want a second pair of eyes on something, just let me know." No big deal. I expected a thanks, or maybe even a small, reluctant nod. Instead, she stopped scrubbing, put the plate down with a loud clank, and turned to face me. Her eyes were hard. "Thanks," she said, her voice dripping with an icy sarcasm that could freeze a Texas summer. "But I don't need help from the business major. I think my 4.0 GPA is doing just fine." There it was, the business major. She said it like it was a dirty word. Like my entire field of study was some cute little hobby compared to her noble, world-saving pursuit of medicine. In that one sentence, she had perfectly echoed my parents' entire investment philosophy. I was the fluff, she was the substance. The door I had tried to open was slammed shut in my face. It was a clear, unambiguous message. Stay in your lane. The blue chip stock doesn't need advice from the risky startup. That was the moment I learned a tough, but necessary, lesson. You can't help someone who is determined to believe you're beneath them. You can't offer a life raft to someone who insists they're not drowning, even as they're gasping for air. Her pride, or whatever it was more important than accepting help from her lesser sister. I just looked at her, the dark circles under her eyes, the forced arrogance in her voice, and I nodded slowly. "Okay," I said quietly. Message received. I finished drying my dish, walked out of the kitchen, and mentally closed her file. I had tried. The ball was in her court now. From that point on, I decided my energy was a finite resource, and I was going to invest it where it would grow. In my business, in my chosen family, and in myself. I stopped trying to figure out the bug in her code. I had my own to build. And as it turned out, my little project was about to get a major system upgrade, while hers was heading for a full-blown, catastrophic crash. After that Thanksgiving, I went back to Austin and put my head down. I poured all my energy into my work. Freeza, the silly free pizza app, started to evolve. We realized students didn't just want free food. They wanted to connect. We added features for study groups, event reminders, and a campus marketplace. We rebranded it as Campus Connect. It was growing fast. By my junior year, we had users on 3 different campuses in Texas. By senior year, we were fielding calls from venture capitalists. And then, a few months before graduation, the call came. A major Austin-based tech company, the kind that has slides instead of stairs in their office, wanted to acquire us. The negotiations were a whirlwind. Dr. Evans and Aunt Carol, my dream team of an advisor and a cutthroat CPA, were by my side the whole time. The final deal was for a sum with a lot of zeros at the end. Enough zeros that I could pay off my student loans in a single wire transfer, and still have enough left over to buy a lifetime supply of something other than instant ramen. As part of the deal, I would stay on to run Campus Connect as its own division, with a fancy title and a chunk of company stock. I had done it. The risky, volatile lizard sweater startup had just hit the jackpot. A few days after the deal closed, I got a call from Aunt Carol. I expected a congratulations or a lecture about tax implications. Instead, her voice was quiet and serious. "Chloe," she said, "we need to talk about Megan." My heart dropped. "Is she okay?" "Physically, she's fine," Carol said, "but I've been doing some digging. You know your mother's weekly reports." The numbers weren't adding up. An A+ in OChem, then treasurer of this, president of that. It sounded too perfect. Like an earnings report that's been cooked. This is where having a retired forensic accountant for an aunt comes in handy. She had a friend who worked in the university's administration office. She had called in a favor. A very big, very unofficial favor. The A+ in organic chemistry, Carol said, her voice grim. It was a lie. She didn't get an A+, Chloe. She failed it. Miserably. The phone felt cold in my hand. She failed that and 2 other required science courses last year, Carol continued, her voice low and steady as she laid out the facts. She's been on academic probation for 3 semesters. It was like a dam breaking. The dark circles under her eyes, the crying on the phone, the desperate, defensive arrogance. It all made sense now. But how is she still in the program? I whispered. How are they letting her graduate? That, Carol said, is the million-dollar question. Or, to be more accurate, the $50,000 question. She explained what she had uncovered. The college fund my parents had so proudly allocated to Megan wasn't just for tuition. It had become a secret, off-the-books bailout fund. They had spent thousands on elite, private tutors. They paid for her to retake the failed courses at an expensive private summer school. And then came the real bombshell. There was a donation, Carol said, the word dripping with disgust. A very generous, 5-figure, unrestricted donation made to the science department last spring, right around the time Megan was about to be kicked out of the pre-med program for good. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. My parents hadn't invested in their sure thing. They had been desperately trying to stop their blue-chip stock from crashing to zero. All the bragging, all the weekly reports, all the pressure. It was all a frantic effort to prop up a failing investment. They weren't funding a success story, they were covering up a disaster. And the most painful part, they did it because they couldn't bear the thought of being wrong. Their egos were so tied to Megan's success that they would rather lie, cheat, and throw money at the problem than admit that their safe bet had gone bust. They couldn't face the shame of their perfect ROI turning out to be a total loss. I hung up the phone, my own success feeling hollow in that moment. My victory felt tainted by their deception. I wasn't the family's only startup, after all. Megan was one too, a failing one they were pouring venture capital into just to keep the illusion alive. Graduation was in 2 weeks, and what was once supposed to be my quiet, personal triumph was now shaping up to be something else entirely. It was going to be a reckoning. A final, public audit of the Hayes family's secret, toxic portfolio. Graduation day arrived. The Texas air was thick with humidity and anticipation. For most families, it was a day of pure celebration. For the Hayes family, it felt more like heading into a high-stakes shareholder meeting where a hostile takeover was imminent. My parents had rented a whole row of seats for the family. They were in their Sunday best, beaming for the cameras, ready to celebrate their sure-thing investment, Megan finally crossing the finish line. Limping, subsidized, and built on a foundation of lies, but crossing it nonetheless. I, on the other hand, was walking in with a different kind of confidence. Underneath my black graduation gown, I wore a designer dress I'd bought myself. On my wrist was a sleek, expensive watch, a gift from the board of the company that had acquired mine. I wasn't the speculative stock anymore. I was the CEO. As we all found our seats, I saw my chosen family in the audience. Dr. Evans gave me a subtle thumbs up. Leo, the drummer, was surprisingly cleaned up in a collared shirt. Juniper gave me a little wave. And right in the front row, next to my parents, sat Aunt Carol. She caught my eye and gave me a slow, deliberate wink. The kind of wink that says, "Showtime." The ceremony droned on with the usual speeches about following your dreams. And then, the dean of the business school walked to the podium. Each year, we select one student to represent the graduating class, someone who embodies the spirit of innovation and resilience. This year, that honor goes to Ms. Chloe Hayes. A polite ripple of applause went through the auditorium. I saw my parents exchange a confused look. Chloe, our Chloe, the lizard sweater startup Chloe, I walked up to the stage, the silence of 1,000 people settling over the room. I took a deep breath, looked out at the crowd, and began. I didn't talk about anger or betrayal. I didn't mention my family at all. Instead, I talked in the only language my father truly understood, the language of business. "Good morning," I started. 4 years ago, I came to Redwood as an unproven asset, a high-risk venture with no initial backing. I was, in market terms, a penny stock. And I learned quickly that the most valuable lesson in business, and in life, is how to build your own value when the market undervalues you. I talked about the power of the pivot, not just in business, but in life. Sometimes, I said, looking towards my parents, the most promising investment on paper can turn out to be a liability. And the venture everyone wrote off can become the cornerstone of your portfolio. The key is not to be afraid to admit when a strategy has failed and pivot to where the real growth is. I ended by thanking the people who had invested in me. "I want to thank my real board of directors," I said, my voice full of genuine emotion. To Dr. Evans, who taught me that failure is just data. To my roommates, who provided marketing, branding, and existential dread in equal measure. And to my Aunt Carol, my first and most ruthless advisor, who taught me that the best revenge is a well-audited life. The crowd erupted in applause, louder this time. As I walked back to my seat, the university president took the stage for the final recognitions. "Before we conclude," he boomed, "we have a few special honors." He adjusted his glasses. "First, it is my pleasure to announce this year's valedictorian for the School of Business, graduating with highest honors, Ms. Chloe Hayes." Another wave of applause. I saw my dad lean over and whisper something to my mom. Their confusion was visibly growing. The president wasn't done. Furthermore, Ms. Hayes is the founder of Campus Connect, a platform recently acquired by a major tech firm in a multi-million-dollar deal, making her one of our university's most successful undergraduate entrepreneurs to date. The applause was a roar now. People were turning in their seats, looking at me. I dared a glance at my parents. Their faces had gone from confused to completely, utterly stunned. But the final blow was yet to come. And what makes these achievements all the more remarkable, the president declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall, is that Ms. Hayes accomplished all of this while being entirely self-funded, working multiple jobs to pay for her tuition and living expenses without any family financial support. Boom, the silence that followed that sentence was deafening. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Then, a slow, rolling wave of murmurs and whispers spread through the audience. People were looking at my parents, not with admiration, but with a new, dawning understanding. I watched their faces. It was a masterclass in emotional collapse. The pride drained away, replaced by shock. The shock gave way to a stark, cold horror. It was the look of two people who had just realized that their secret, toxic accounting had been made public. They weren't just the proud parents of a successful graduate anymore. They were the parents who had refused to support the very daughter the entire university was now celebrating as a hero. They understood, in that horrifying, public moment, that everyone in that room who knew them would now be asking the same, single, devastating question. If you didn't pay for her college, where did all that money go? The scoreboard had just been wiped clean, and a new game was about to begin. The family dinner that night was supposed to be a celebration. My parents had booked a private room at the fanciest steakhouse in town, but the atmosphere wasn't celebratory. It was thick with the kind of tension you could cut with a steak knife. The air was filled with unspoken words and the quiet clinking of silverware. My extended family, who had all witnessed the public drama, kept shooting me impressed, curious glances. They'd ask me questions about the acquisition, about my plans, completely ignoring Megan, who sat silently, staring at her plate as if it held the secrets to the universe. For the first hour, my parents tried to pretend nothing had happened. They played the role of the proud parents of two successful daughters, but their smiles were strained, their laughter a little too loud. Finally, during a lull in the conversation, my father cleared his throat and turned to me, attempting a jovial, fatherly tone that completely missed the mark. "Well, Chloe," he said, forcing a chuckle, "you've certainly been holding out on us. A multi-million-dollar deal? You kept that one pretty close to the chest. The audacity of it, as if I were the one keeping secrets, was almost impressive." The old me would have shrunk. The old me would have mumbled an apology. But the CEO me, the me that had stared down venture capitalists, just took a slow sip of water. I placed my glass down deliberately and met his gaze. "No secrets, Dad," I said, my voice calm and even. "Just financials you chose not to look at. But since we're all here and we're all about ROI, let's do a little audit, shall we?" A hush fell over the table. Aunt Carol, sitting next to me, leaned forward with a predatory grin. This was her Super Bowl. I turned to my parents. Portfolio A, Megan Hayes. Initial investment, full tuition, room, board, and, as we now know, a substantial bailout fund for tutors, retaken classes, and a hefty donation to the science department. The projected return was a prestigious MD. The actual return is still pending, I believe. My mother flinched as if she'd been struck. My father's face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. Portfolio B. Chloe Hayes, I continued, my voice never wavering. Initial investment, 0. I was self-funded through scholarships, loans, and a chaotic collection of side hustles. The projected return was, well, we all agreed it was a gamble. The actual return is a paid-off education, a successful company acquisition, and a seat on the university's tech advisory board. I leaned back in my chair. So, from a purely business perspective, which asset performed better? No one spoke. The only sound was Megan, who let out a quiet, choked sob. That's when she finally broke. "I hate it," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "I hate pre-med. I hate chemistry. I hate the hospital. I never wanted to be a doctor." She looked at our parents, her voice rising with years of repressed frustration. "I only did it because it's what you wanted. Because you made me feel like if I wasn't perfect, if I wasn't the sure thing, I would be nothing. I would be Chloe." She slapped a hand over her mouth, realizing what she'd said. But it was too late. The truth was out. Being me was her worst nightmare. My father finally deflated, all the engineered bluster gone, leaving behind a tired, defeated man. We just wanted you to have a secure future," he mumbled, looking at his hands. I saw what happened to my own father when his business failed. "I didn't want that for you. And I couldn't bear the thought of telling our friends that our perfect daughter was struggling," my mother added, her voice barely a whisper. The pressure, it was too much. We were just trying to protect the family's image. There it was. Not malice, not a lack of love, but something almost worse: fear and ego. Fear of failure and an ego so fragile they were willing to sacrifice one daughter's well-being and smother the other's identity just to maintain an illusion of success. The lesson that night was a heavy one. Sometimes, the people who push you the hardest aren't trying to build you up. They're trying to build a monument to themselves, using you as the bricks and mortar. And when the monument starts to crumble, they'll do anything to hide the cracks. The rest of the dinner was a blur. The steak didn't get eaten. The champagne wasn't opened. The Great Hayes family portfolio had been officially audited, and it was bankrupt not financially, but morally. And as we all sat there in the wreckage, I knew that before we could even think about rebuilding, we had to clear away all the lies. After that dinner, the old Hayes family portfolio was officially dissolved. What came next wasn't about forgiveness, not right away. It was about rebuilding. It was about constructing something new from the wreckage, on my own terms. I didn't cut my parents off. That would have been too easy and, frankly, not my style. Instead, I established new terms and conditions for our relationship. A few weeks later, I sat them down, not as their daughter, but as an equal. Our relationship going forward, I told them, is going to be a new kind of venture. There will be no more investments or weekly reports. There will be no more talk of sure things or risky assets. From now on, there's only one metric: honesty. You can be a part of my life, but you have to be a part of the real one, not the one you wish existed. It was a slow, awkward process, like a messy merger between two completely different companies. There were stumbles. There were setbacks. But for the first time, we were all looking at the same, real set of books. As for Megan, once the pressure was off, she blossomed. She dropped out of the pre-med program, which was the bravest thing I'd ever seen her do. She enrolled in art school and discovered she had a real talent for graphic design. Our relationship, once a cold war of resentment and jealousy, slowly thawed into a genuine friendship. We were no longer competing stocks. We were just sisters. With my future secure, I decided to invest in other risky ventures. I went back to Redwood University and met with the dean. I used a significant portion of the money from the acquisition to establish a new scholarship. We called it the Scrappy Start Scholarship. It wasn't for the students with perfect GPAs. It was for the ones like me, the hustlers, the dreamers, the ones with a wild idea sketched on a napkin and no family money to back it up. It was a fund for the underdogs, which brings me to today, a few years later. I'm sitting in my office looking out at the Austin skyline. The company I built is thriving. My phone buzzes. It's a message from Megan. She's attached a file, a new, brilliant logo she designed for the Scrappy Start Scholarship. It's a drawing of a small, determined squirrel climbing a huge oak tree. It's perfect. My desk phone rings. I pick it up. It's Aunt Carol. "Hey, boss," she says, her voice full of that familiar, raspy humor. "How's the portfolio looking today?" I lean back in my chair and smile, a real, genuine smile. "It's looking good, Carol. It's looking really, really good. You see, my parents were right about one thing. Life is about investment. It's about figuring out where to put your time, your energy, and your belief. They spent years trying to teach me about return on investment, about backing the sure thing. But the most important lesson wasn't in their spreadsheet. The biggest return on investment I ever made was betting on myself. And that's a portfolio that never goes down. Thank you so much for coming along on this wild ride with me. My story had its reckoning, but I know there are thousands of you out there with your own stories waiting to be told. We're going to be sharing more journeys like this one, stories of quiet battles, unexpected triumphs, and the sweet, sweet sound of proving the doubters wrong. So if you want to be here for the next audit, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You definitely don't want to miss the next quarterly report.